Thanks, Veronica. So I am going to talk about some of the stakeholder interviews we conducted with stakeholders in Central Australia. So you will see that a lot of the things I'm saying, people have already talked about already. Sorry. First, I'll start with some of the climate projections for Alice Springs. In the morning, Mark did mention that we have already crossed some of the climate projections that were made in terms of heat waves, extreme heat. I think Alice Springs is a very good example for that. If you look at the climate projections for 2050, the one I've circled in red, you can see that there are 118 days with temperature greater than 35 degrees centigrade and about 35 days with temperature greater than 40 degrees centigrade. Those are the climate projections. But I also plotted the numbers against the current numbers. So if you look at the annual average for the period 2018-2021, we are spot on that 2050 climate projections. So it looks like there's quite a lot of research studies that's happening across Central Australia. There's discussions about energy efficient housing, but most of us probably are looking at the climate projections for maybe 2030, or we are looking at current levels, but we have crossed all of those. We are heading towards maybe projections for 2050 or 2090, 2018, 2019, those 2 years, we had projections that were matching 2090. I have deliberately taken a median emission scenario because that's what we all think we are doing, like we are trying to mitigate. So in that way, maybe we can justify that maybe we haven't reached that point, but still all of the discussion surrounding whether it's transition to solar energy or transition to renewable energy, all of these needs to consider the climate projections as well as current climate trends. So it looks very less complicated. Solar energy is abundant in Central Australia. There's so many remote communities that are using diesel. It's expensive for the government. But still, why is it not rolled out in a rate that we think it should be? So that's what we went and talked to stakeholders. And there were a few interesting findings that came out of it. And I think Veronica did mention about financial incentives. And it looks like financial incentives do work. So if, for instance, like there's so many incentives that's provided to the Alice Springs community, and we can see that there's an uptake of solar panels. But when we consider remote communities, the issue is that mostly the whether it's diesel power, generated power, or whether it's through solar panels, usually subsidized by the NT government. So if we look at the motivation behind a transition, what we find is that probably economics will not work there. We need to look at other benefits. And when we talk about other benefits, that might be health benefits. And Norman Frank's example, like the story is a perfect example of all of that. Like he is a renal patient. He needs to store medication. He needs to be able to be in a thermally comfortable housing. So none of those things do work in that case. So promoting those health benefits or the environmental benefits, the contribution communities are giving towards, mitigating climate change. All of these needs to be highlighted so that the barriers can be removed from there. There are a number of regulatory barriers. Again, Norman Frank's story is a very classic example of how to navigate from the process of having a prepaid system within a house where you buy electricity using power cards to how you actually transition to using solar energy and how you can actually get paid for feeding back into the system. So it's not very straightforward. Most of the houses in remote communities are probably rented. They are owned by the Department of Housing. So decisions cannot always be made by community members, even if they, people want to actually move to renewable energy. Another barrier that was discussed, and this is particularly in terms of having large-scale solar farms. So there are a number of approval processes that are required. For instance, making sure you have approval to access land, making sure all the necessary environmental impact assessments are done. Probably that may not be a big issue for Central Australia, but further north, that environmental impact assessments and all are very important. So it's always a time-consuming process. So it makes it really hard to attract private investors to come here and create a large-scale installation and roll it out. And so that community members, including Alice Springs residents living in the town, can actually benefit from it. There are also technical barriers. First and foremost, I think all of the stakeholders I talked to said, it's very hard to maintain a solar system in a remote community. The transport costs are usually high. It's very hard to get maintenance staff there. Often people, they kind of move around. They have family responsibilities, cultural responsibilities. So even if you are training a community member, you need to make sure you have trained at least 3 or 4 community members so they can take turns in terms of maintaining the system. Moving on to social barriers, as I mentioned before, many households, they do not own the house. So probably someone else has to make the decision for making sure that, we are using clean energy and things like that. There was another important point, but that was discussed by stakeholders. Like often people are very accepting in terms of, are we using clean energy? We would like to see more and more of it, but, I wouldn't give my roof space to have a solar panel in it. So that attitude can be everywhere, whether it's a remote community, whether it's a town, city, it happens everywhere. People are supportive, but don't really want a huge infrastructure or, something like a storage battery or like a panel on your house. So moving on to the enablers, there's not many enablers, but of course the government commitment for us, the NT government is committed that by 2030 we'll switch to at least 50% renewable energy. So that's a huge driver in terms of having projects and also ensuring that there are private investors interested in the NT. And also in terms of financial incentives and, making sure that at least the government meets the commitment. So indirectly, all of us will benefit. Another key enabler that was discussed was the community involvement or community partnership in solar installations. And again, I think Veronica did mention about the Bushlight project. So the Bushlight projects, they actually had quite a lot of installations. And when the funding ran out, there were several installations here and there that actually couldn't be, operated. It couldn't be maintained in the long term. So one of the key issues that people are discussing at the moment is solar waste. Like, all these panels, storage batteries, they all end up in these communities. And, no one is actually transporting this waste and, making sure communities is in the form it should be. So citizen science ownership and, ensuring that there's people within communities that can actually maintain and take ownership of it and understand the benefits of this. And also make sure that after, this particular solar installation is not working, it needs to go out of the community as well, is important. Another enabler is peer pressure. So this is actually discussed very widely in developing countries, I think. So if I have a solar panel in my house, my neighbor will kind of think, oh, she has a solar panel, I need to get that too. So it was very interesting to hear that from stakeholders here, because a few stakeholders mentioned that some of the community members come to them and say that we would like to shift to clean energy, especially because the other community has done that. So it's a form of pride, like, we are also, technologically forward and we're contributing towards, climate mitigation. So that seemed to be a very interesting outcome from the conversations. And I think it's an enabler as well. So one of the stakeholders also mentioned that, maybe even promoting those kinds of videos of how community members have actually utilized solar energy and how that has changed people's lives. That might be a very good way to promote solar energy. Again, financial incentives, as I mentioned, it depends on, how the context. It might work for some people, but for some people, if electricity is already subsidized and provided at a rate, maybe that financial motive is not there. So finally, one of the strategies that we wanted to use, we wanted to understand how best could we promote the benefits of solar energy. So economic benefits are there, but there's definitely other benefits. What about the environmental benefits? Are people, or do stakeholders hear a lot about the environmental benefits from community members? So it looked like maybe not. People are aware, but maybe that's not highlighted. And it looks like it's more important to actually make videos, promotional videos, share stories. Like we heard a lot of stories in the morning, but share stories and highlight how much remote community members are contributing towards climate mitigation. And I think that is huge in terms of actually encouraging more community members to take up solar. Again, health benefits. I am just going to skim through it because we heard lots of stories, like Linda gave examples of, how much health benefits come through solar, clean energy transition. We just saw the story of Norman Frank. So these are all things that need to be actually highlighted. And also the ability to stay in country. Like stakeholders did mention quite strongly that people prefer to stay in country. Like you may have a respiratory issue, as Linda mentioned, and you do not want to be like, traveling to the Alice Springs hospital for that, but you would like to, if you can be treated within a community, you would like to use that service within the community, stay connected to country. So just to summarize, it looks like there is a deficit in terms of, promoting best practice examples, and that is probably our next step as part of the CE4 project. Just promoting those best practice examples means that we could, to some degree, put in some peer pressure there and encourage more people to be co-advocates with, with researchers and policymakers or whoever, bring everyone together and say that, okay, this is what we need to do. We are in Central Australia. We have solar energy. We can use it abundantly, and this needs to be done.